Good afternoon, Eugene City Club members, civic leaders, and guests. I'm proud to be here this afternoon to represent Measure 80, which is a historic opportunity for Oregon and the nation to bring sensible thinking to the issue of how we interact with and manage the marijuana market. I'd like to start with a piece of Oregon history that helps us understand the situation we find ourselves in. Back in 1932, Oregonians voted to end the failed policy of alcohol prohibition. Oregonians personally understood that regardless of whether they consumed alcohol or even supported the alcohol industry's existence, alcohol wasn't going anywhere, and prohibition was the worst way to deal with it. So they changed their mind and decided to regulate alcohol. Note I said that was 1932. Federal prohibition wasn't overturned until 1933. And many in the status quo at the time, police and prosecutors and sheriffs, said that it wasn't possible. Oregon couldn't do it, expect the federal government to follow, but follow they did. We come to today, and Oregon's wine industry is a $3 billion a year industry employing over 10,000 men and women with jobs in agriculture, food processing, marketing, finance, retail services. And Oregon's beer industry is more than $2 billion a year, employing thousands and bringing and keeping money in our state. These same industries that were once illegal are now the pride of Oregon, and not because of some miraculous cosmic shift or because the federal government acted first. It's because Oregon voters saw what we were doing wasn't working. We decided to try something different. In that spirit of acknowledging the facts and using common sense, Oregon's Measure 80 simply says marijuana prohibition has failed in Oregon and across the nation. And we have an opportunity to fix a long-standing failure, regulate a market that isn't going anywhere, and create jobs, new tax revenue, and a sensible policy for our state. Measure 80 will regulate marijuana like liquor for adults 21 and older, with sales through state licensed stores and with all the tough DUI penalties we already have in place. Not only that, Measure 80 includes penalties for consuming marijuana in public, just like it's against the law to drink in public, and makes it a felony to sell marijuana to minors. It also funds development of new testing to detect impairment while driving and medical studies to determine when people are impaired. Currently, marijuana is decriminalized in Oregon, so possession of an ounce is an infraction like a traffic ticket. But if you go a tiny bit over that ounce, it's a felony. Last year, well actually in 2007, there were 9,201 arrests here in Oregon for marijuana. According to Jeffrey Myron, a Harvard economist, regulating marijuana and taxing it will free over $60 million a year in criminal justice costs. Each arrest means dollars are spent on law enforcement, booking time, court costs, prosecution, in many cases imprisonment for the growers and dealers. So Measure 80 will save tens of millions of dollars a year in public safety costs associated with the enforcement of these failed laws. And it's critically important, especially here in Lane County, where just this year the county jail released nearly 100 inmates this summer due to budget cuts resulting from drastic cuts in the federal timber subsidies. Among them was a man who admitted he had committed murder. Fox News reported there are now 6 to 8 hours every day when citizens can call for help from a deputy, but there won't be anyone on duty to respond. Public safety is in serious jeopardy, and it's time to be smart on crime and with our resources. Opponents of a sensible policy like Measure 80 want you to believe that the world will end, that the problem isn't that bad, that we can't possibly move forward ahead of the federal government. But they're wrong. And even our opponents will tell you that one of the most important things, that this drug prohibition isn't working, and it isn't. Another argument you'll hear from the defenders of the failed status quo is this: we don't have a marijuana policy failure here in Oregon. We have medical marijuana. We were the first state to decriminalize marijuana years ago. one of the first states. And I'm here to tell you those arguments don't really hold water. And here's why. As long as prohibition is the law of the land, Oregon's medical marijuana patients, providers, and even our frontline law enforcement officers will always operate in a confusing web of conflicting state and federal laws. And while decriminalization was a necessary step, it's not sufficient. Nothing is done to diminish the black market for marijuana. As long as marijuana is illegal, it will be profitable, and people will break the law to grow it, sell it, and get it to consumers. And since we consider marijuana safe enough to decriminalize the possession of up to an ounce, it's time we take the next step and regulate its sale to those over the age of 21 through state-controlled stores. When we end prohibition, marijuana will be like any other legal, regulated market, transparent, legitimate, and competitive. Regulating marijuana is not impossible, it's inevitable. Our state government regulates practically every industry because the alternatives don't work. Look at the energy industry in California when they deregulated it. We got Enron, or the housing market for that matter. You can ask the millions of Americans who've been incarcerated for simply using marijuana, a naturally growing plant. So how will we regulate marijuana in Oregon? Measure 80 establishes an industry commission made up of 7 members in the first year. Those 7 members will be appointed by Governor Kitzhaber. They can come from the agricultural industry, the medical community, the legal field. It'll really be up to Governor John Kitzhaber to establish that first commission. And that commission will help set up the initial rules that will govern how this industry is set up here in Oregon. Maybe you've read various editorials on Measure 80 and have questions about that commission. They've tried to scare you by using terms like marijuana grower. Well, let me ask you this. Are you afraid of grass seed growers that dominate the grass seed industry? Or Christmas tree growers that dominate the Christmas tree industry? Or grape growers who dominate the wine industry? You know, I think a better term is gardeners, or even better, farmers. Even the Board of Pharmacology is required by law to consist of 5 pharmacists out of a board of 7. And the Oregon Medical Board is composed entirely of physicians. The truth is, illegal marijuana growers don't want Measure 80 to pass. They'd love to see Measure 80 fail, because Measure 80 will cripple the black market and bring legitimate legal competition to the marketplace. When we repeal prohibition and regulate marijuana sensibly, we'll give the opportunity to thousands of Oregonians to be legitimate, to open businesses, create jobs, and invest in our community. And we can finally restore agricultural hemp for fuel, fiber, and food to our farmers and inventors. And I believe that'll be the biggest opportunity when we pass Measure 80. Marijuana prohibition was not really about drugs. It was really about hemp fuel and hemp fiber and suppressing it. The word marijuana itself comes from a Pancho Villa Revolutionary Mexican War song, La Cucaracha. When the PRI, Pancho Villa, succeeded, they prohibited, or they nationalized the petrochemical industry. Therefore, the petrochemical industry did not like them. When Oregon farmers can grow hemp, which their Canadian counterparts are already growing and earning $50 an acre as opposed to $10 an acre for wheat, we'll see true economic development in our rural communities. And when Oregon farmers can sell their hemp fiber to Oregon's pulp and paper mills and sell their hemp oil to biofuel refineries like Salem's Sequential Biofuels, and sell their hemp seed to Oregon companies like Bob's Red Mill for cereal and Living Harvest for hemp milk, then we'll see economic development for our entire state. Local jobs, living wage jobs, sustainable jobs, all for Oregon. And that's why we've received the backing of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. They were one of our first endorsers. The #1 reason that Americans have suffered 40 years of a failed war on marijuana is not because of public safety. It's because for 40 years we've been told that to even question the sanity of these laws is shameful and unpatriotic. But after trillions of dollars wasted and countless lives ruined, we can no longer be intimidated. We have to stand up and say what we're doing has failed, and we need a new approach. When we talk about reforming our laws, we're often told, what message are we sending to kids? Well, that it's easier for kids to get marijuana than it is liquor. You know, today, for the first time, the use of marijuana by high school kids is greater than the use of tobacco. In fact, the use of alcohol and tobacco are at historic lows, while the use of marijuana by high school kids is at a historic high. We educate them about liquor and tobacco, and that's exactly what we'll do with Measure 80, regulate and educate. 8 out of 10 kids in Oregon say they can easily get marijuana now, and street dealers don't have to abide by identification requirements and age limits like they have to for alcohol and tobacco. This is what prohibition's done, this quote-unquote success of prohibition. Well, I, for one, know we can do better. We can do a lot better, and we could do it through regulating this market. And here's how Measure 80 does that. It takes the incentive and the extensive market that's prevalent now and brings it under state control. It directs the money from tax revenue of marijuana sales toward education, drug treatment, and the general fund. And it gets the message out to Oregon's youth that marijuana is not appropriate for kids, just like liquor and tobacco. We Oregonians have a proud history of tackling issues on our own way. And our way in Oregon is to look at the facts, be pragmatic, and come up with solutions that are sensible and effective. We did it with the bottle bill, we did it with the beach bill, with land use, mass transit, and health care. In 1994, we passed the Death with Dignity Act. The federal government came in and enjoined it from going into effect, but the United States Supreme Court, less than 2 years later, in 1996, upheld it, and it went into effect. I think the same thing's likely to happen with Oregon's Measure 80, and we specifically wrote it to be upheld in that inevitable federal court challenge it'll face after passage. Please join me and the organization and individuals that have already taken a stand against the failed war on marijuana. That includes the NAACP, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, the Pacific Green Party, the Libertarian Party, Oregon Ways and Means co-chair Representative Peter Buckley, former Secretary of State Bill Bradbury, Portland City Commissioner Randy Leonard, Libertarian presidential candidate Gary Johnson, Governor Gary Johnson of New Mexico, and Green Party presidential candidate Dr. Jill Stein. Join us in ending the long, failed war on marijuana and regulating marijuana sensibly and effectively. You know, the saying, insanity, is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Well, the war on marijuana is insanity, and Measure 80 is the antidote. It's sensible, sane, and effective, and overdue. I urge you to vote yes on Oregon's Measure 80 for the safety of our youth, for the prosperity of our economy, and for a model that we will serve to the rest of the nation. Once again, that Oregon can lead the way, that we are pioneers today as we were pioneers 150 years ago. And I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Rob Bovett. I am the elected district attorney for Lincoln County, Oregon. First off, thank you to the Eugene City Club and its members for inviting me here, and also thank you to Paul Stanford. I very much appreciate your comments. I have a couple of disclaimers. First is that I don't purport to represent the position of anyone other than me. I represent a lot of entities, but I'm just speaking for me, so I may say some things that some of my friends go, wow, what did Rob just say? But there you have it. Second is, I'm not Josh Markey, so for those who were really looking forward to Josh Markey, I'm sorry to disappoint. Josh Markey is, of course, the district attorney for Clatsop County and the marquee district attorney, so to speak, our star in the District Attorneys Association. So I'm a poor representation for Josh, but he's off on fancy national business that's very important, and he called me up the other day and said, Rob, you got to cover this for me. So here I am. Third if you're really looking forward to hearing from a frothing at the mouth drug warrior, reefer madness person, I'm not that person either. I'm just going to sorely disappoint you. So with my disclaimers done, what I'd like to do, since I'm new to this debating Measure 80, and frankly I hadn't looked at it a whole lot until the other day, I'd like to kind of go through a couple of the points that Paul made and give you my thoughts on those points. But first, I think I'd like to do something else, and I think it'll just confirm the polling information we heard earlier. I'd like, just by a show of hands among the audience here, who would support, and forget about Measure 80 for a moment, who would support the legalization of marijuana just as a general concept? All right. And who is opposed to the legalization of marijuana as a general concept? All right. And who is neutral, doesn't care? Okay, so just for those that are in the radio audience, I think it's fair to say that 98% of the people in the audience support the legalization of marijuana. Is that a fair characterization? All right. All right, so this is the audience, and that's fine. I guess my point here is that I'm really not here to debate the legalization of marijuana. What I'm here is to tell you why you ought to vote against Measure 80, even if you support the legalization of marijuana. So let's kind of go through some of the concepts here that are contained in Measure 80. And I think it's noteworthy, as Paul mentioned, there's been some op-ed pieces that have really kind of slammed Measure 80. In fact, I can only find one op-ed piece that actually supported it, or the editorial boards of your Register Guard, the Oregonian, the Corvallis Gazette. Everybody's basically said why you shouldn't vote for Measure 80. They all tend to start at the same point, which is, there are 3 ballot measures on for legalization, so-called legalization of marijuana in our nation come here November 6th, Colorado, Washington, and Oregon. The big money backers of these initiatives are only supporting 2 of them. For the first time, they're not supporting Oregon's measure. And there's a reason for it, and the editorial pieces point out these reasons, and I'll mention a few of them. But first, I think I'll just respond to a couple of points that Paul made. He made a lot of comparisons to prohibition. I think those are apt comparisons, but I think you have to consider the context, because frankly, what happened in Prohibition was, based on moral assertions and whatever authority they wanted to assert, basically the federal government decided that we were going to ban something that 65% of the public used regularly. That's crazy. That's insane. It was destined for failure from the day it was enacted. We got a little different situation with marijuana, because across the board, Americans, only about 8% of Americans use drugs other than alcohol. So we don't have something that is infused into our culture. So we've got a little bit of a distinction there. I don't think prohibition's a good comparison. He also mentioned toward the end of his opening statement the Death with Dignity Act. And we are innovators here in Oregon. I'm proud of that history of innovation. The Death with Dignity Act was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court because, frankly, we had a crazy United States Attorney General who was trying to take the Federal Controlled Substances Act and read into it things that simply weren't there, based on his moral positions. And correctly, we defended that successfully all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and told that Attorney General, you're crazy. That's not what the Controlled Substances Act says. It's not a good comparison to what we're doing here with marijuana, because what the Controlled Substances Act clearly says on its face, whether we like it or not, is that marijuana is a Schedule I controlled substance federally. They may have designed it to defend federal scrutiny, but it ain't going to. What they're going to require is the Attorney General to spend a lot of money defending that which is indefensible. So I appreciate the effort, but it frankly is not going to survive federal scrutiny. I'm also afraid, as many of the editorial pieces are afraid, that we've become very progressive in Oregon, and we've done some fantastic things. Back in 1973, we were the first state to decriminalize less than an ounce of marijuana. It was driven actually by a district attorney here from Eugene, for those of you that are around at the time, supported by the district attorneys, and we've had that on the books ever since. We were also one of the first states to enact a medical marijuana law. We've been very progressive when it comes to marijuana. I personally support the rescheduling of marijuana. I think it's inappropriately been in Schedule 1 from day one. I also have major problems with the Controlled Substance Act itself, but that's well beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. What I fear is that by pushing the envelope to absurd extremes, we are going to invite the federal government to come in here and stomp on us. And I'm afraid for the Medical Marijuana Act, and I'm afraid for our other progressive approaches to marijuana. In terms of Measure 80, the law enforcement community is united, no surprise, but what's even more surprising to me is the 36 elected district attorneys, after reading Measure 80, universally oppose it. We never agree on anything. Can you imagine 36 elected lawyers agreeing on anything? We actually agree on this one because it has some fundamental problems. It's not just about legalization of marijuana. We could have that debate if we were in Washington or Colorado. This one does a whole lot more. It's 7 pages of single-spaced fine print. There's a reason why George Soros hasn't pumped his money into this one, because it pushes the outer limits of what can stand scrutiny. It establishes this so-called commission with phenomenal powers of citing, authorization, rulemaking, all of this stuff. And as Paul correctly mentions, the first commission would be 7 members selected by the governor for 1 year. After that, 5 of the commissioners, an overwhelming majority of the commissioners, would be selected from the marijuana growers themselves. This is akin to having Philip Morris do tobacco regulation. That's crazy. And I think George Soros has recognized that's just crazy. If we want to vote on marijuana legalization, we ought to vote on marijuana legalization. Back in 1986, we voted on it. It was soundly defeated, but I agree with the polling. A lot has changed since 1986. I think if we had a measure like the Washington measure, the Colorado measure, we could debate whether or not we should or shouldn't legalize marijuana appropriately. What I fear is, in Measure 80, is we set up this so-called state control, the state control of the super board run by marijuana growers, modeled after so-called the OLCC, although the OLCC, much like, for example, the Oregon Board of Pharmacy, are appointed by the governor, not elected from among pharmacists. These are all folks appointed by the governor, so there's political accountability. That's not what's in Measure 80. And so we essentially established this super commission to so-called regulate this stuff. The problem, I fear, as a practical matter from my work in the legislature, and I do lots of work in the legislature, is establishing another super lobby. I've been fighting the pharmaceutical industry and the liquor distribution industry that are all encased and enshrined in state law. And we can't do anything, for example, about the sorry state of alcohol taxes, for example. We have one of the lowest rate of alcohol taxes, not even indexed to inflation. We haven't raised it for decades. Alcohol taxes fund less than 15% of the social damage caused by alcohol. We choke treatment because we can't have appropriate alcohol taxes, because we have enshrined in the OLCC laws a super lobby of alcohol distributors that monopolize everything, and we can't accomplish anything. We're going to do exactly the same thing when it comes to marijuana. I'm opposed to this whole scheme, this whole setup, and I think you ought to take that into consideration. As the Register Guard kind of noted, I think we do place our progressive laws at some risk by essentially pushing the outer limits of what the federal government, for example, might be willing to tolerate. They basically look the other way with our Medical Marijuana Act, and I'm glad they do. Is there some tune-up we can do to our Medical Marijuana Act? Absolutely. There's people that abuse it. Frankly, there's people that abuse patients, and we need to fix that stuff. But I don't want to place that at risk. I thought, the other day, the Corvallis Gazette-Times came up with a nice piece, and I would encourage you, by the way, to read the Register Guard's piece. I thought it was very thoughtful, and I appreciate the editorial boards of these papers actually spending time to actually read the measure, and I would encourage you to do the same thing, which is the Corvallis Gazette-Times basically says, it's a wildly overreaching ballot measure, and they encourage everybody to brew an extra cup of coffee, sit down and read what's actually going on in this ballot measure, and I encourage you to do the same. And I agree with the Corvallis Gazette-Times and the Register Guard and the Oregonian when they say basically there's little doubt that state and federal drug policy relating to marijuana is a mess. It needs to be fixed. But Measure 80 is not the solution. It's as the Oregonian refers to, it's a comically bald attempt to turn marijuana in Oregon from a tolerated drug into a celebrated cash crop. We need to actually do this the right way. And as they ended in their statement, in their op-ed, and I'll end here because I'm much more interested in your questions and responding to your questions, I think we can do this in a thoughtful way with the appropriate ballot measure designed to not empower a new super powerful lobby in Salem. I don't need to be fighting the marijuana industry and not be able to raise taxes because they're in control of everything. I need to not be fighting yet another powerful lobby that we have enshrined in statute. Let's just deal with the legalization of marijuana. Let's deal with a straight-up ballot measure. I think the polling says that may actually fly in Oregon. We don't need all of the other stuff that's been jammed into Measure 80 that will create all these additional problems. We need to fix the mess, but Measure 80 just compounds the mess. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
And now it's time to form your questions as a table. Please remember that questions are a privilege of membership. However, anyone may participate in the drafting of questions. And as always, when we have a panel, please make it clear who your question is to when you ask your question. Thank you.
Hello, Jansen here, member since 2012. My question would be for our DA person here. It sounded like you weren't against it. It was just the legality of how it's been proposed and stuff. So I guess my question is, would you and your cohorts help write something that you would support?
And I can't speak for my cohorts. I can only speak for myself. I don't represent the DAs. I think we don't even get there on this measure, of course, because it has so many other structural problems. I don't think, if I'm predicting my crystal ball, I don't think you'll ever get the Oregon District Attorneys Association to endorse outright legalization of marijuana. That's just not in the cards. And so I can't even suggest that would even happen. But I think fundamentally, and if you read our piece in the voters pamphlet that just came out, at least in Lincoln County, came out yesterday, our primary objections to Measure 80 all have to do with the structure, the state bureaucracy that it creates, this super commission to essentially have superpowers that are really unassailable. I mean, that's our primary problem with Measure 80, and I think that's George Soros's problem with Measure 80. I think they overreached. I think if they just would have put on the ballot, should we legalize marijuana or not, I think we would have had something better to talk about.
Do I get an opportunity to rebut that?
Nancy Afterrose.
Oh. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
No problem. Thanks. In Washington State and in Colorado, the initiatives there were developed by George Soros's group, the Drug Policy Alliance, Peter Lewis's folks with the ACLU of Washington. So they drafted it, polled, then they drafted it again, and then they paid to put it on the ballot, and they qualified for a vote in January. Our initiative didn't qualify for a vote until July, and they didn't have much input on this wording. We asked them for input, but we really didn't get it. They were putting their resources in Washington and Colorado. So it isn't that they oppose what we're doing, it's that they are leading the way, and it's really their baby in Washington and Colorado. When we look at the commission structure, initially we were going to put control of the marijuana market under the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, and we did a $5,000 poll. And I saw a smirk from your president over there on that one. And we found that there's a belief that the OLCC is corrupt. That's an entirely politically appointed board. And that there are a lot of people who would never vote to put anything else under the control of the OLCC. So we decided to create a separate commission. First, we were going to have them all political appointees by the governor. I decided at the last minute to give our farmers a greater hand in it. Now, our initiative requires that licenses to cultivate marijuana be equitably distributed among all applicants. It'll be akin to the tobacco allotments in the Southeast, where a farmer who has 500 acres might get an allotment to grow 1 acre of tobacco, and he'll make more money off his acre of tobacco than his other 499 acres of corn or whatever it is. So we decided to give our farmers the ability to elect 5 members of the commission. And so the legislature would immediately, but the first year, the governor will be appointing all of the members. And that is the first year is when most of the administrative laws will be created. Now, there's an administrative law process here in Oregon where the rules have to be posted and printed, and then there's a debate and a process that's governed by law before you come to the final rules and regulations. So that's what our initiative will do. It will, first year, the governor will appoint all the members, and then after that, farmers will elect 5 of the 7 members. But if there's a problem with that, and I've offered to work with the DA here in drafting changes to that if necessary.
And can I guess comment quickly, because I think this is a real hot and button point with a lot of folks, even who support the legalization of marijuana. And I'll just quote directly from the Oregonian. Measure 80 would create a new 7-member commission dominated by 5 players in the marijuana community. These members, quote, elected at large by growers and processors, unquote, would have the majority vote in overseeing marijuana cultivation, sales, licensing, and promotion. This is the equivalent of putting Philip Morris in charge of state tobacco policy. What could possibly go wrong? Now, in terms of Washington and Colorado, Washington and Colorado's initiative place limits on personal possession and cultivation, and both include provisions intended to control the number and location of pot shops. Makes sense. Oregon's includes no limits on personal possession and cultivation, and leaves zoning and licensing up to the grower-dominated Oregon Cannabis Commission. This is exactly the wrong design.
Okay. Nancy Afterrose, City Club member. I have just a question that I think may be a yes or no answer. I would like to know what should be. I would like to know if this law is like the alcohol law, in that parents in the home can provide a drink or marijuana to their children as long as the children are still in the home. Of course, once they cross the front steps, it's illegal for them to have alcohol on their breath. Would that be true of marijuana? Thank you.
Our initiative has a provision that says that parents, as under the alcohol law, would be able, in the privacy of their home, to allow their children over the age of 18 to consume some cannabis, whether that be a food product or via inhalation is not discussed.
So I think the answer was yes.
Yeah.
Kathy Ging, I wanted to ask Paul about what the makeup of the commission would be, and also regarding hemp. Popular Mechanics in the early last century had a front-page article called Hemp, the Billion-Dollar Industry. Since that time, 31 industrial nations have legalized hemp. We are the only ones who have not legalized hemp. And I'd like to know what the economic impact would be of legalizing hemp. Lastly, I'd like you to say a few points about Run From the Cure, the Rick Simpson story. This is available on YouTube, Run From the Cure, and it's about how you can make 1 pound of indica bud makes 3 ounces of hemp oil, or they call it hemp, but it's actually THC oil, and it can cure cancer in 4 months, and he's cured 1,000 people of cancer. Let's talk about the transnational corporate agenda that prevents this from happening. Thank you.
Certainly. A good friend of mine, also an attorney, passed away earlier this year, said that the people really responsible for marijuana prohibition are the petrochemical, pharmaceutical, military, industrial, transnational, corporate, elite, fascist ruling class.
Is that one word?
No. Oh. So it's really about hemp fuel and hemp fiber. They invented the whole marijuana myth as a smokescreen, pardon the pun. And she talked about this video called Run from the Cure, there's a lot of proof that cannabis, it's a strong, powerful antioxidant and an anti-inflammatory. And while it might not work for all forms of cancer, it can definitely help cure some forms, such as brain tumors. They found that it's very effective for brain tumors, a number of other forms of cancer as a treatment. I wouldn't say use it exclusively, but as an adjunct to traditional medicine, cannabis can be very useful in the treatment of cancer and the side effects of chemotherapy.
Yes, John DeLoe, City Club member, and I have a question for either one or both of you. There are people who don't want to legalize marijuana, and these are people who make money off of keeping it illegal. Can you mention some of them or talk about that a little bit?
Well, as I mentioned in my introduction, there are a number of marijuana growers and dealers who are not in favor of Measure 80. They don't want to see competition. They want to see the prices artificially inflated. You know, we set the price under this to discourage, the statute says the price will be set to discourage illegal import and export. So at first, while the rest of the surrounding states have a marijuana prohibition in place and Oregon is legal, maybe they'll pass it in Washington too, but say Idaho, Nevada, California, the price will be higher, which will generate a lot more tax revenue. Then the price will gradually come down to discourage illegal export, and so that we can compete with other legal markets. But it will also provide cannabis through pharmacies. We'll develop cannabis instead of having these willy-nilly dispensaries open up that have no regulation. It will regulate it. They'll study it intensely. We'll fund those studies. The defense by the Attorney General's office in the federal court will be funded entirely by grower and processor license fees, not from the general fund. And the studies of cannabis will be funded through the sales of cannabis. It won't be funded from the general fund either. So this bill is entirely self-funding.
And that's where he and I just respectfully disagree. I think that the numbers they've crunched, both in terms of the savings and the revenues, are all, well, to borrow Vice President's phrase from last night, malarkey. It's all fantasy. We're not going to see these huge savings, as Professor Myron would like to believe. Professor Myron, for those of you that are not familiar with him, he's kind of an extreme libertarian. He has made his, kind of career bashing things like the Recovery Act and Obamacare. He went after, Warren Buffett for daring to say that the wealthy need to pay more taxes, and he supports full legalization of all drugs, including meth and heroin. No surprise, he's crunched some numbers and said we're going to save $60 million by not enforcing marijuana laws in Oregon. That's malarkey. I mean, we have so de-emphasized marijuana enforcement in Oregon for so long in terms of policies, laws, and practices. Let me just give you an idea. I got 3,000 criminal cases coming into my office every year. About 300 of those cases, about 10%, are drug cases. You know how many of those cases are marijuana? About 15 to 20. So less than 0.5% of the cases I handle each year have to do with marijuana. We got over 14,000 people in prison in Oregon. By the way, we have the highest percentage of violent people in prison. We actually do a good job of incarcerating those who need to be incarcerated. You know how many of those 14,000 plus are actually there for possession of marijuana? 6. And each of those 6 is a plea down from a major charge. We don't lock people up for marijuana. This $60 million of savings is malarkey. All these tax revenues, all these people that are making money, growing and selling marijuana, most of them we don't catch. We're a marijuana exporting nation, Oregon is. I hear this all around the nation. These people are going to sign up for his commission, pay him taxes, and get a license when they're doing fine right now, and subject themselves to federal prosecution by putting themselves on a list that any federal grand jury could get in a heartbeat? I don't think so. Just use common sense.
Bob Cassidy, City Club member. Our table listened very attentively about the potential problems of this super committee and the kinds of things that could come up because they were appointed by the governor or elected at a later point. Our concern was, we assume this is not in the Constitution, so changes don't have to come from the election, from an election of the people. Can't we trust the legislature to correct any problems that would be?
I guess I'd like to tackle that first, because I've spent a great deal of my career in the legislature, and I don't want to speak ill of your particular legislators. They're wonderful people. I've enjoyed working with them. I have to work with them again in a couple of months. But when we put into state statute, even though we can amend it, we put into state statute a structure that creates a certain subset of folks as a super industry. It's nearly impossible to change it politically. I'll give you an example. After Prohibition, we had this OLCC structure. Part of the crazy structure they dreamed up in the 30s involved super empowering, not the, basically it's the distributors of alcohol. We have not raised our alcohol taxes in Oregon since 1977, and they're not indexed to inflation. They cover virtually nothing when it comes to treating alcoholism. We're going to create exactly the same thing here. We're going to create a super powerful lobby that is not going to allow the law to be tweaked in any way that they don't want it to be tweaked, and they back it up with lots of money, power, and influence. I'm just telling you the reality of what happens in Salem. We would like to believe that anything can be changed, and it's true, anything can be changed. But what I see in this structure is actually worse than what I've been fighting in terms of structures of powerful industries in Salem for 30 years.
I don't know why he keeps using this word super powerful committee. Super, like we have some superpowers or something, because it's a statutory initiative that the legislature could change. In fact, we've already worked on a draft to address the commission structure with Representative Brad Witt. And so I told him I'd be happy to work with him to address any concerns, to change it in the legislature. And we're more than willing to do that. I don't think giving our farmers control of this commission is going to lead to problems. He complains about the processors or the distributors of alcohol being the ones that have the power with the OLCC. Well, like I said, we were going to put this under the control of the OLCC, but after asking around, we found that that was very unpopular. So we decided to create a commission of its own, and I think that's the right way to do it.
We shouldn't be enacting something that's already broken in the hopes that we can fix it. It's been my experience that when we enact things by the initiative process... It's not necessarily broken. It's broken.
It's not broken.
Okay, well.
It hasn't even been imposed. Randy Prince, City Club member. A question about the age that marijuana would be legally available under this measure. We heard about the problems of Prohibition, trying to make a law when people are in fact just doing the opposite and not going to change, especially when it's widespread. For that reason, alcohol prohibition was abandoned, and in the 70s they decided that the 21-year-old age really wasn't working out too, also because people were flaunting that, so many states went down to 18 if they hadn't already allowed it, say for beer. That was reversed, but again we're seeing proposals from college presidents and so on that the 21-year-old alcohol age is causing a lot of problems. Maybe the way to curb illegal behavior is to change the law about what's legal or not. Now that's a very dangerous drug. Marijuana has few of those hazards, and you've said that it's actually more popular or equal to the dangerous drugs. So why would we go short on trying to stop the illegal conduct and by adjusting the laws to what's a reasonable thing to allow people to do, and say age 21. So my question for our DA is, you said, well, it'd be better to just put out a legalization measure. Would that measure be for age 18 or 21? And for Paul, why did you choose 21 over 18? Well, what would you do if you were in his position to or if you were in the position of just proposing legalization?
I don't want to answer for Paul. Do you want to answer why you chose 21 versus 18?
Well, obviously there are kids in high school at 18 years of age, and we don't want to put marijuana in the hands of high school students. So we chose the age of 21 because that's the age we have for alcohol and that was what we thought would be most beneficial for our state.
And I guess I have a comment about another piece of your question, which implied something that I think is simply not true, which is that marijuana is not a dangerous drug. Frankly, I don't know how you define danger. What I will concede freely is that in comparison to things like meth and heroin, marijuana isn't even on the chart. But the reality is that if after alcohol, the number one drug dependency issue that drives Oregonians into treatment today is marijuana. It's the number one.
Isn't that mostly court imposed?
No, actually it's not, because we actually send so few people into the court system. These are mostly voluntary referrals or self-referrals or family referrals. People that right now, currently 35% of all drug treatment admissions are marijuana as the primary drug of abuse. That exceeds meth. Now, 5 years ago, meth was way up there, and we've knocked it down, so I admit that. But how you define dangerousness, that's a very loaded term. Am I afraid of this reefer madness stuff, that people get loaded up and smoke some dope and go do, frankly, a lot of things that people do when they're on meth? No, totally not. Am I saying that all drugs are equal? No. But marijuana is a drug. Marijuana can be abused. Not by everybody, but it can be abused. And some people become dependent and need help. And the structure of Measure 80, in my opinion, is not only not conducive to providing those people help, the structure will actually leave us in the same situation where we are at with alcohol today.
You know, currently alcoholics and addicts in this state cannot get treatment.
Right.
It's $10,000 a week. 7% of the proceeds from the sale of marijuana will go under our initiative, Measure 80, to fund alcoholic and drug treatment programs on demand. We estimate that'll be about $20 million a year for people to get the help they need. You know, he said that we don't have people in jail for marijuana. Well, what happens is anyone on probation or parole, they're given drug tests and they're searched. And most of the people incarcerated in prison for probation and parole violations are there for marijuana offenses. So that's where we have the $60 million a year savings we'll see when we regulate marijuana. So those numbers he cites too, they are those marijuana treatment numbers. Most of it is driven by court referral.
Well,
they're doing it for to get out of more serious sentence from the judges.
That's just all flat wrong.
Well, why don't we move on to the next question, because we do have about 5 minutes left and we have several more questions. So please try to keep your answers short so we can get everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. John Belcher, now burying a question from my table. This is for both of you, and it comes from someone at our table. How can we determine what percentage of Americans use marijuana? Because it is illegal. This person reported that 20 million people have been arrested in the United States for marijuana use, and assumedly they're a small percentage of the total of users. So that person is asking, what is the true percentage of marijuana use in the United States?
Do you want to?
You know, a lot of times when people are surveyed by an anonymous pollster, they don't know who's calling them on the telephone. There are a lot of people in the closet. So a lot of times the most vociferous anti-marijuana opponents that we have to face are actually closeted marijuana users. So you look at Idaho, you know, their senator who was caught in the bathroom stall in Minneapolis for oral sex or something, he was one of the strongest opponents of rights for gay people. And so people aren't going to answer honestly to an anonymous pollster when they're called on the phone if they're afraid that someone might knock on their door and arrest them.
We find actually the opposite to be true based on the NS-DUS study, which is done nationally every year, and it's a national study that surveys drug use. We find that people are actually more willing to admit to marijuana use than they are to, for example, meth or heroin use, probably for obvious reasons. But actually getting a firm number on it, it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge, and I don't think the federal government has any great system to do that.
Hello, my name is James Baldock. I have a question for the district attorney. Your main argument seemed to be that you'd be creating this group that proposes rules, and then passing a statute through the legislature would be too difficult because of an industry lobby group already in place. I'm confused, or I wasn't quite understanding why the marijuana industry lobby would be any stronger than, say, you know, the Oregon State lawyer, the Oregon State Bar, or any other industry group. Like, if you propose taxes on lawyers, of course they're going to fight hard not to have taxes on them. So I'm just wondering why you feel specifically this super committee would be so unassailable compared to any other lobby group.
I actually don't feel it would be super unassailable as compared to others. I think it's very comparable to many others we have right now. I gave you one example in terms of the liquor industry. I gave you another is the tobacco industry. I think the wrong thing to do is to set up a framework where we elect, or no, we don't even elect, where the tobacco industry elects 5 of its own tobacco growers to serve as the majority of a commission that regulates tobacco. That is a design for disaster, in my opinion and experience, and that's exactly what we're proposing here with Measure 80. Let's just do a straight vote on marijuana legalization without all of this nonsensical
That's
state
what we have
bureaucracy.
here. That's what we have here. And I can tell you that I run a series of clinics across the United States where we have doctors who help patients get medical marijuana permits. So what I am going to do is basically end the need for patients to go to our doctors. And I have funded this initiative primarily myself. And I can tell you that we don't have money to buy a lot of advertising. So this high-powered marijuana lobby that he thinks is going to control the legislature, heck, we can't even afford a TV ad, you know? So I don't think he needs to worry about that.
Jansen, question from one of our visitors today participating with our questions. How will this measure affect current medical patients' fees and stuff? So let's say it goes in, are their fees going to go up, down, any other
This
effects?
does not affect the Oregon medical marijuana program itself because we didn't want to change it. We didn't want to scare patients, think that the law would change and they wouldn't be able to access the program. But the fees are now so high that this poor lady sitting right here, Elvie Masika, is one of the few people in the United States who gets legal, 4 people I think left in the United States who gets legal marijuana from the federal government itself. They give her 6 pounds a year, but it's very low quality. Because of the increase in fees, she lives on $700 a month. She couldn't afford the new $200 fee for the medical marijuana permit. And so she has actually lost a lot of her sight because of that. So this would lower the cost of marijuana and have it available in pharmacies, just like every other drug. We will just end the whole myth that marijuana is a dangerous substance. It'll be regulated like other drugs. It'll be available in pharmacies, and adults over the age of 21 will be able to buy it, raising significant resources for our education and public safety.
We have one last question. If you could just answer briefly, that would be
sure.
This, I guess, Carolyn Kranzler in our table wondered, how does Measure 80 address use of hemp for fiber purposes? And I guess it's for you, Paul.
Sure, our initiative will allow farmers to grow hemp for fiber, fuel, and food. And 2% of the proceeds of the sale of marijuana to adults through state stores will go to promote Oregon biofuel from hemp and Oregon fiber and Oregon food. So our farmers would be able to cultivate hemp and put us on the cutting edge of this industry because we don't have this artificial low THC limit in hemp. We shouldn't be looking at hemp and saying we can only grow the type that has less than 0.3%, which is what they allow in Canada and in Europe. By lowering the THC level, what they've done is they bred out the flowers. And by breeding out the flowers, they bred out the seeds. And guess what that means? No biofuel. So our initiative will allow farmers to grow hemp based on, not on its THC level, but on its productivity for production of fuel, fiber, and food.
Thank you for this, for bringing clarity and vision to this discussion of Measure 80.